This is 1RPH, where print becomes sound.
We at 1RPH wish to thank the Canberra Times for the daily provision of their newspaper to enable us to bring you this news reading service.
Thank you for joining us here on Radio 1RPH in Canberra on this rather wet Tuesday, the 24th of August. My name is Camilla Shaw, and I've been joined in the studio by our second reader of today, Andrew Tremaine, who's been busy preparing the Canberra Times for us both. I'd like to welcome him, and here he is to start this programme.
Thanks, Camilla. Hello, listeners. On the front page of today's Canberra Times, there is a picture of Canberra Raiders centre Curtis Scott with the headline, Scott Shown the Door, and two articles. COVID ward to be set up at Calvary Hospital, which we'll read in a little while, and the lead article, Dire Death Toll Warning, Delta variant. Around 25,000 could die if COVID if nation opens up under current targets. This article's by Harley Dennett. Australia's national plan to relax COVID restrictions risks a catastrophic death toll, new modelling shows. As the Prime Minister and New South Wales Premier continue to talk up easing restrictions before the community is protected. Researchers from three of Australia's most prestigious universities warned tens of thousands of lives could be saved by revising the national plan to vaccinate children and reaching 90% vaccination coverage among adults before exposing Australians to uncontrolled COVID-19. Their modelling shows Australia would see between 25,000 and 43,000 COVID deaths and more than 270,000 people with debilitating long COVID if governments and health officials follow the national plan. That plan has COVID restrictions relaxed at a vaccination rate of 70% of people aged 16 and over, and almost no restrictions at 80%. In contrast, the original Doherty Institute modelling used to revise the current national plan estimated between 1,300 and 2,300 deaths over 180 days from a seeding event of the virus. It did not estimate outcomes if the test, trace, isolate, quarantine strategy failed to clamp down an outbreak. One author of the new modelling, Professor Quentin Grafton from Australian National University, said statements from Scott Morrison and Gladys Berejiklian in favour of easing restrictions at a flat rate of 70% of adults was like handcuffing the nation's public health response while overtaxing its health workforce. We need much higher vaccination rates before we could contemplate handcuffing ourselves in relation to public health measures, Prof Grafton said. Although it's an epidemic in New South Wales now, with more than 800 new cases each day, it's a tiny fraction of what it could be if we open up and don't have proper public health measures and inadequate vaccination coverage. Even if Australia did achieve a 90% vaccination rate with children, the new model found fully relaxing public health measures to eliminate community transmission would eventually still result in around 5,000 deaths and 40,000 cases of long COVID. The government should have decided what level of fatalities it would tolerate and work backwards to determine the vaccination rate needed to achieve that. But that was not how the national plan was developed, Prof Grafton said. It's a no-brainer, a simple calculation to make, and it doesn't therefore make sense from the Prime Minister's statement on Monday that at 70% that we should stop having lockdowns because the cost is not worth it. That's not what our modelling finds. Children could also benefit from vaccination, he said. If Australia could achieve 75% vaccination coverage among children and adolescents, it could prevent a further 12,000 hospitalisations. Australia is expected to have enough mRNA COVID vaccine doses to achieve almost total population coverage early in 2022. The warning comes as Scott Morrison hit out at two premiers, Queensland's Anastasia Palaszczuk and WA's Mark McGowan for indicating they would defy the Commonwealth's plan. However, Ms Berejiklian urged people in New South Wales to focus on the vaccination rate rather than the number of COVID cases, which remain above 800 each day. Once we hit 70% double dose, we will be able to live life more freely, and once we hit 80% double dose, essentially we would have normalised the way we treat COVID. Dr Zoe Hyde, lead author of the new modelling, said premature relaxing of the restrictions would likely be irreversible, the resulting deaths unacceptable. It's simply too dangerous to treat COVID-19 like the flu, Dr Hyde said. That was the lead article on the front page of today's Canberra Times, continued on page 6, Dire Death Toll Warning. It's by Harley Dennett. Turning now to the shorter article on the front page, COVID ward to be set up at Calvary Hospital, and this article's by Lucy Bladen. A new specialist respiratory ward at the Calvary Public Hospital could treat COVID patients after mental health patients were moved to a new facility at the private hospital. Health authorities have prepared the new ward that could be used in case Canberra's COVID outbreak worsens. Canberra's COVID positive numbers grew to 137 on Monday after 16 cases were added to the most recent outbreak. 3 were infectious in the community. 4 people were in hospital, but only 2 had COVID-related symptoms and none required respiratory assistance. ACT Chief Minister Andrew Barr said the goal was to get to 0 cases, but conceded waves may come back into the community. We'll be at risk continuously. The short-term task is to manage this outbreak. The medium-term task to protect the community while we get vaccinated, Mr Barr said. Now that concludes the articles and headlines on the front page. There's more on the COVID ward on pages 4 and 5, which I'm sure we'll get to later in the bulletin.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm reading from page 6. Nation must not fear reopening, Prime Minister by Dan Jarvis-Barty. Prime Minister Scott Morrison insists the country must start to reopen when it hits vaccination targets, declaring lockdowns and heavy restrictions are not a sustainable way to live. But Mr Morrison has emphasised Australia won't have a UK-style Freedom Day when effectively all restrictions are lifted at once. His comments came as ACT Chief Minister Andrew Barr again called for the nationally agreed vaccination target to be expanded to include 12 to 15-year-olds. The national plan to steer Australia out of the pandemic is in jeopardy, with states, including Western Australia and Queensland, threatening to chart their own paths even once targets are reached. Under a reopening plan based on modelling from the Doherty Institute and agreed to by the National Cabinet, states and territories would ease some restrictions once they had vaccinated 70% of people aged 16 and over, if the same coverage had been achieved nationwide. At 80%, lockdowns would only be used in highly targeted situations, and Australia would start to reopen to the world. Doubts over the safety of reopening the country at those rates have risen in recent weeks as coronavirus outbreaks have worsened in Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra. The Doherty Institute's modelling assumed there would be just 30 cases of community transmission at the time states moved to the second stage of the plan, far fewer than the numbers currently being registered across the East Coast. Mr Morrison said in question time that he had received advice over the weekend that the number of cases would not influence the overall conclusions of the model. Labour asked Mr Morrison to table the advice but was told it was confidential. The Prime Minister had earlier used a press conference at Parliament House to heap more pressure on the states to hold true to the national roadmap out of the pandemic. Mr Morrison said with high rates of vaccination, Australia should not fear the prospect of reopening the country and the inevitable rise in case numbers. Instead, it should prepare for and embrace the path out of the pandemic, he said. Lockdown is taking a heavy toll, and so they must only continue for as long as they are absolutely necessary and not a day more, he told reporters. It is always darkest before the dawn, and I think these lockdowns and demonstration of that, but the dawn is not far away, and we are working towards that dawn, and we are hastening towards that dawn. We should not delay. We should prepare for it. We should not fear it. We should embrace it, and we should move forward together. Mr Barr said the ACT had agreed to the national plan because it believed there needed to be a pathway forward. But the ACT has 2 points of difference, which Mr Barr reiterated again on Monday. He wants more children to be vaccinated, with the latest outbreaks, including in the ACT, highlighting the threat of the Delta strain to younger Australians. He also wants the plan to take into consideration the fact that individuals aren't fully protected until 2 to 3 weeks after they receive their second dose. Mr Barr said he was on a unity ticket with Mr Morrison about the importance of vaccination and his assurance Australia would not replicate a UK-style Freedom Day once its targets were met. The ACT Chief Minister took a swipe at unnamed senior politicians and media outlets who, he said, had glossed over the details of the national roadmap, which makes clear restrictions, including lockdowns, would remain a possibility even once 80% was hit. Page 6. Nation must not fear reopening, Prime Minister.
A couple of shorter articles now. Don't delay COVID test, Vic Premier pleads. Victorians are ignoring coronavirus symptoms to the point where some children are fainting and vomiting at school. The state recorded 71 local COVID-19 cases on Monday, of which 55 were not isolating when they should have been. Of the new cases, 49 are linked to known outbreaks, but the sources of 22 infections are a mystery. Premier Daniel Andrews on Monday revealed a small number of people infected with COVID-19 had taken a few extra days to get tested. This thing moves so fast that even a few extra days almost guarantees that you will give it to multiple other people, your family, the people you love the most, and you don't want that, he said. Mr Andrews said some close contacts of positive cases were not self-isolating for the required 14 days. COVID-19 commander Jerome Weimar said while some cases were asymptomatic, others were seriously ill prior to testing positive. Mr Weimar also appealed to young men in Newport, west of Melbourne, to get tested after 10 more cases were connected to that cluster, noting there are payments of $400 for casual workers required to get tested and $1,500 for those required to self-isolate for 14 days. Among the new cases are 5 staff and patients at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, where an infected Shepparton man had surgery on August 12. He was not tested for COVID-19 before being admitted and had been in various parts of the hospital. That was Don't Delay COVID Test, Vic Premier pleads. That article is on page 3. Turning now to page 5. Life pretty damn good by November. Hazard. New South Wales has recorded its 3rd consecutive day of 800 plus new COVID-19 cases, but the state's health minister says life will be pretty damn good within months due to vaccinations. The state recorded 818 new locally acquired COVID-19 cases in the 24 hours to 8 p.m. on Sunday, as well as 3 deaths. All 3 deaths were people in their 80s, with 2 from southwest Sydney and 1 from Newcastle. The death toll for the current COVID-19 outbreak is 74. Premier Gladys Berejiklian said a record 738,000 people were vaccinated in New South Wales last week, with 5.9 million jabs in arms to date. Ms Berejiklian has previously flagged increased freedoms for fully vaccinated residents once New South Wales records 6 million vaccinations. That total was set to be reached last night. She declined on Monday to discuss the types of restrictions which could be eased, saying announcements would be made by Friday. However, this would not include an end to stay-at-home orders, which will remain in place until at least August 28 in regional New South Wales and at least September 30 in Sydney and surrounds. But Health Minister Brad Hazzard on Monday told a parliamentary inquiry life in New South Wales would be pretty damn good by November, as vaccination coverage approached 70 and 80%. Mr Hazzard also said he hoped to sign a public health order by week's end mandating vaccination for New South Wales healthcare workers. More than 3/4 of healthcare workers in New South Wales have had at least one vaccine dose, rising to 89% in metropolitan areas. But the Health Minister said he wanted to be as collaborative and encouraging as possible, given union concerns. Ms Berejiklian, meanwhile, also promised to soon clarify whether school students would be able to return to classrooms in Term 4. It is important for us to minimise any risk when they go back to school. Our health experts in particular are working on how the HSC can be done. We have provided certainty for parents in terms of September. Unfortunately, we've said current conditions remain in place, the Premier said. And that was Life Pretty Damn Good by November. Hazzard. That article's on page 5 and is accompanied by a man riding his bike with mask near Sydney's Royal Botanic Gardens on Monday.
Page 10. ADF on standby for Kabul extension by Gerard Coburn. The Morrison government says Australia is on standby to assist the United States with an extension of its extraction mission from Kabul's international airport. Foreign Affairs Minister Maurice Payne on Monday said defence personnel were awaiting orders by US officials to extend its withdrawal efforts from Hamid Karzai International Airport following the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan a week ago. We are part of those discussions, and if they ought to be extended, we are absolutely ready to support a continuing operation at Hamid Karzai International Airport. The last 24 hours, we have evacuated over 450 people from Kabul on those 4 ADF flights, Ms Payne said. Ms Payne confirmed 271 Australians and Afghani visa holders had already been brought to Australia, including 175 people arriving in Melbourne on Monday morning. During question time, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said any new Afghan government would be held to account with regards to human rights, especially for women and girls. He also noted the Australian Defence Force was attempting to extract citizens, permanent residents and visa holders from one of the most extreme conditions ever operated in. These evacuations are both dangerous and complex. Landing slots in Kabul are limited and on-the-ground time is also, Mr Morrison said. Roughly 1,000 people have been extracted from Kabul from Australian aircraft and include Australian, UK and New Zealand citizens and a number of vulnerable Afghans, including women, children and Hazaras. Mr Morrison also said the 3,000 spots to Afghan refugees was floor and would increase Australia's annual refugee intake if necessary. We will be resettling people who have legitimate claims through our official humanitarian programme. We will not be providing a pathway to anyone who seeks to come here by any other means, he says. Ms Payne noted the situation remained volatile and access to the northern gate of the airport remained closed. The most significant challenge continues to be access to Hamid Karzai International Airport, she said. National Security Cabinet is meeting on a daily basis. From page 10, ADF on standby for Kabul extension.
Couple of articles from page 9 now. Childcare subsidies for communities in COVID-19 lockdown. Childcare centres and after-school services in coronavirus hotspots will be subsidised to keep afloat during lockdown. The federal government will pay childcare providers 25% of their pre-lockdown revenues and outside school hours care services 40%. It's expected to cost between $40 million and $50 million a week after childcare access was restricted in parts of the country. About 4,800 providers and 380,000 families are expected to benefit. Federal Education Minister Alan Tudge expects attendance to fall off a cliff. We're cognizant of that and therefore want to make sure that those childcare centres will be viable, he said. They need to stay open, particularly for those essential workers to be able to drop their kids off and go to the hospitals and go to the medical clinics. Childcare services in Sydney and the ACT and after-hours care in Melbourne will be eligible immediately. All other services in Melbourne and across regional Victoria and New South Wales will be eligible after 7 days. Payments will be backdated to the scheme's announcement. The subsidy will extend to all childcare providers across the country after 4 weeks of lockdown. It comes on top of previously announced support for centres to waive gap fees for non-attendance. But centres who want the latest subsidy can't claim any other federal support. Eligibility will be assessed on a centre-by-centre basis. Centres must anticipate attendance below 50% and will be required to maintain current staffing levels. That was childcare subsidies for communities in COVID-19 lockdown. The next article on page 9, potential new slavery laws pointed at China. This article is by Gerard Cockburn. Products such as designer shoes and sportswear could be banned for sale in Australia if there are known links to slave labour under new proposed laws. A private senator's bill tabled by South Australian Independent Rex Patrick has passed the Senate, which would enact new laws to ban imports to Australia with known supply chain links to slavery and forced labour. Mr Patrick introduced the bill primarily to curtail the number of manufacturing goods imported to Australia that are known to use and exploit forced Uyghur workers under the control of the Chinese government. The proposed laws passed the Senate despite not being supported by the coalition, but Mr Patrick said the bill was a blunt instrument, but was needed to thwart modern slavery. We need to send a very clear political signal to Beijing and to the numerous global brands that have been happy to turn a blind eye to China's massive exploitation of forced labour, he said. The proposed legislation will now move to the House of Representatives for debate. That was potential new slavery laws pointed at China. And that article by Gerard Cockburn is on page 9.
There is one death announcement today. Here's Andrew.
Miller, Kenneth Robert Sidney, known as Ken, late of Greenslope Street, the Lakes North, Cairns, aged 90 years. Most dearly loved husband of Judy, deceased. Loved father and father-in-law of Malcolm, deceased. Lee, Sue Ann, Brett and Kathleen. Rob. Loved grandfather and great-grandfather of their families. There will be a private funeral at the Cairns Crematorium in commemoration of him on 26th August 2021. And that's all the information there is on that death notice of Kenneth Robert Sidney Miller.
Radio 1 RPH acknowledges the continuing support of the Community Broadcasting Foundation in bringing this radio reading service to print handicapped listeners in the ACT and surrounding region.
Thank you for joining us here in Canberra on Radio 1 RPH, where we tune on 11:25 a.m. We bring information from the papers, and we are the information station. And Andrew referred to, of course, the situation in Canberra with regard to COVID-19, and there's more news on pages 4 and 5. First of all, I'll read the new exposure sites, which I think is vital for all of us. In Turner, in Condamine Court, various dates on August the 17th, 18th and 19th, and in Nichols, the Bright Bees Childcare, August the 17th, 18th and 19th. And a specialist respiratory ward has been set up at Calvary, and testing sites have been affected by the wet weather yesterday. Of course, you've all seen, I'm sure, the photographs of cars queuing up outside, so not a lot of fun for the people doing the testing. However, to continue with what is written in the Canberra Times on page 4, Specialist COVID Ward for Calvary, Lucy Bladen. A mental health ward at Calvary Public Hospital in Bruce is being cleared to prepare for a COVID specialist respiratory ward in case Canberra's outbreak worsens. There was a stark warning from ACT Chief Health Officer Dr. Karen Coleman on Monday, telling people to get tested as there is active community transmission in the territory. There are 4 people in hospital with the virus. However, 2 of those are in hospital for non-COVID reasons. The other 2 are being treated, but do not require ventilation. But the ACT government is making preparations in case a specialist COVID ward is needed, and a ward has been converted at Calvary Public Hospital in Bruce. The Canberra Times understands patients from the mental health care ward at Calvary Public Hospital in Bruce have been moved to a new facility in Calvary's private hospital. The government has also considered flipping the Garand Surge Centre back into a COVID intensive care unit, and there are plans in place in case this needs to occur. The $23 million venue has been used as a vaccination clinic more recently. The ACT reported 16 new cases of COVID-19 on Monday. 3 were infectious in the community and 13 were linked to existing cases. The total number of cases in ACT residents associated to the outbreak is 137. There are 3 cases in New South Wales that are linked to the outbreak. ACT Chief Minister Andrew Barr said the goal was to get to 0 cases, but conceded waves may come back into the community. The 16 new cases announced was an improvement on the 19 on Sunday, while New South Wales recorded 818 and Victoria recorded 71. We'll be at risk continuously. The short-term task is to manage this outbreak. The medium-term task is to protect the community while we get vaccinated, Mr. Barr said. We're going to have a gentle emergence from lockdown. We won't just snap back. We need to have the settings in place that if the virus comes back in, we're not going to have an explosion of cases. The settings need to reflect that reality. Exposure sites in the ACT have grown to almost 400. This included the addition of the public housing complex Condamine Court in Turner, which was officially listed on the exposure list on Monday. All residents in the complex have been forced into a 14-day quarantine after a positive case was on the premises for 5 days last week. Anybody who was at Condamine Court from Sunday, August the 15th to Thursday, August the 19th will be required to isolate. There are about 70 people living in the complex, including a cohort of elderly and vulnerable tenants. Dr. Coleman had flagged the site as a potential exposure site on Sunday. Testing was carried out on-site at Condamine Court for residents on Sunday, with additional follow-up tests on Monday. Dr. Coleman confirmed there was an additional case linked to Canberra's disability care, bringing the number of cases linked to the cluster to 15. We do continue to work with those directly affected in the wider sector, with a focus on reducing the risk of transmission and providing support, she said. But I would like to acknowledge that the impacts on the sector are wider than those who are directly affected. The main public transmission sites in the ACT are still Lynham High School, Fiction Nightclub, Lennox Jaguar Dealership, Belconnen Basketball Stadium. From page 4, Specialist COVID Ward for Calgary.
A couple of articles from page 3 now. Push for safe ACT construction return. Lockdown. Leaders to meet to discuss safe reopening in Canberra. And this article is by Lucy Bladen. ACT Chief Minister Andrew Barr has flagged he will announce any changes to public health measures for a range of industries by Thursday, as pressure has continued to mount on the ACT government to announce measures to support the return of construction in the Territory. Construction industry leaders, relevant ACT ministers and government officials are set to meet on Tuesday to discuss how and when sites can reopen safely. Thousands of workers have been stood down, and it remains unclear when they will be free to start work again. Mr Barr said the government would review public health directions before or by day 14 of the lockdown, which is Thursday. Work was allowed to restart on the build of a new facility for the Therapeutic Goods Administration on Monday. Construction on the Fairbairn site was deemed as essential works by the federal government, as it will be used to support Australia's COVID-19 response. As it was deemed essential by the federal government, it did not require an exemption from ACT Health. Master Builders ACT Chief Executive Michael Hopkins questioned why some sites were allowed to open and others weren't. If some sites can open up safely, why can't all building sites open up safely? Mr Hopkins said. That's the question that our members have been asking us, and rightly so. We know our industry can operate safely. We've been working very productively with government on what those safety measures would be. We're calling on the government to work with us to reopen the industry as soon as possible, or as soon as it's safe to do so. Mr Hopkins said he understood a small number of projects had been deemed essential, and these were mostly ACT and federal government projects. Mr Barr said the government would look to sites that had been allowed to reopen as a guide for the broader resumption of construction. But the Chief Minister expressed concerns about compliance of rules and regulations, saying it was not always at 100% in the industry. Across the construction industry, like society more broadly, there are people who are excellent, who have absolute and utter commitment to workplace health and safety, Mr Barr said. That was Push for Safe ACT Construction Return. That article by Lucy Bladen is on page 3, as is the next article, COVID-19 Fails to Bring Down Book Week. This article is by Miriam Webber. Parents may have to endure another round of papier-mâché-induced panic this week, as lockdown fails to bring down Book Week. Kids and parents are being encouraged to go ahead with their costumes for the long-running literary week, after the COVID-19 outbreak in Canberra saw a move to remote learning for most students. And for those really stretched for ideas, you can in fact dress your child in a paper bag and claim it as a feminist statement, no less. Library's ACT Executive Branch Manager, Vanessa Little, will be dressing up as the paper bag princess from the children's book of the same name, which subverts the typical damsel in distress tale. We've heard of a number of kids who are really disappointed about not being able to go to school in their costumes, she said. But we're asking them to dress up anyway and to take a photo and post that photo to our Facebook page so that we can continue to see what everybody's up to and celebrate it. Library staff are doing the same, so they're just as disappointed as kids because library staff love to dress up on Book Week. And while deep sighs and begrudging trips to the craft cupboards may take place, the impacts of Book Week for children's relationship with reading are profound, Ms. Little said. It certainly focuses their attention and gives them a sense that books are to be celebrated and that they are part of people's lives, she said. Book Week is also an opportunity for kids to express their individuality through their favourite stories. It's about them being able to express what it is that they like, Ms. Little said. It's so important that kids read because it's a setup for later life. A good reader in their early years is somebody who's highly literate later in their life and is able to learn and have a really successful life. Meantime, ACT libraries have seen a big uptick in online resources during lockdown. Storybox, a service which offers children's stories, is up 323%, while streaming service Canopy is up 67%. Similar increases recorded in Canberra's 2020 lockdown translated to more people using library services in general. We dropped a little bit when things were opened up again, but we didn't go back down to where they were previous to the lockdown, Ms. Little said. So certainly it's introduced people to these services, and some people have maintained the use of them. ACT Libraries is also appealing to adults not to forget the respite reading can offer amid a pandemic which has seized control of the narrative. The Too Busy Book Club will target time-poor Canberrans who intend to read more but can't make big-time commitments. One of the things we find, in so many of the things we do, is that people in Canberra are still big readers, but they're very time-poor, Ms. Little said. That was COVID-19 Fails to Bring Down Book Week, and that article by Miriam Webber is on page 3 and accompanied by a photograph of Kirsten Ray and Mark Milner with their children Sloane, 7, and Ollie, 5, all dressed up for Book Week.
Thank you, Andrew. Reading today, Andrew Tremaine. I'm Camilla Shaw. We could dress up in the studio, but who would see us, Andrew? You want to come next week dressed as a paper bag or as a newspaper? Or I don't know. We shouldn't comment, but why not have a bit of fun? We all need a bit of fun. On to page 10 of the Canberra Times. Baseball bat allegedly used in kill threat by Toby Vu. A man already on bail and serving 3 suspended sentences and his co-accused allegedly used a baseball bat to smash 2 cars before threatening to kill a complainant in front of a child, a court has heard. Raymond James Douglas Gillard and Peter John Rinietz appeared via video link in the ACT Magistrates Court on Monday, each charged with destroying property and possessing an offensive weapon with intent. Both men, aged 32 and 58, have not pleaded to their charges. Police documents tendered to the court state the pair went to the complainant's Narrabundah premises, where he lives with his sister, about midday on Sunday, when they both used the bat to smash 2 Holden rodeos. Gillard of Bonnython was shouting for the complainant before screaming at his sister, who answered the door. The complainant walked out with a large piece of steel for his protection and demanded the 2 alleged attackers leave. Gillard said, "We will be back to kill you," before they left. The court heard Gillard was already on bail for assault, occasioning actual bodily harm, against a different complainant, which he will contest in a December hearing, and 3 suspended sentences for previous offending. Magistrate James Lawton refused bail for Gillard, saying he had breached it numerous times and that he has history of non-compliance with conditions. The court heard Mr. Lawton in April this year warned Gillard to comply with bail, saying, "You're on such thin ice, and that if breached he may face jail." Linnaeus, who was also charged with possessing a knife, did not apply for bail and was remanded in custody. Both men are set to reappear in court on September the 13th. Page 10. Baseball bat allegedly used in kill threat.
ACT leads the nation on EV policy. This article's by Lani Tyndale and it's on page 9. Teslas are notoriously expensive, costing from $85,300. But Queanbeyan resident Tim Mifsud thinks his new purchase will save him money in the long run. For me, the environment was a factor, but it had to make financial sense as well for me and my family. Everyone is different, and not everyone can afford a Tesla. We will be paying about $530 a fortnight for the privilege, he said. When I crunched the numbers of the Tesla compared to a new petrol car, it came out cheaper in the long run to buy the Tesla, compared to something like a hybrid. He said he would charge the car using solar panels on his roof. According to a recent report, the ACT is leading the nation, just behind New South Wales, when it comes to electric vehicle policy. Electric Vehicle Council rated the Territory 8 out of 10, a significant higher grade than the federal government, which only rated 3 out of 10. The ACT has traditionally been a national leader in progressive electric vehicle policy and has continued to complement these efforts over the past 12 months. Electric Vehicle Council Chief Executive Behyad Jafari said. Financial incentives through tax rebates have been complemented by 2 years free registration and a $15,000 interest-free loan. Electric vehicles are popular in the ACT because it is an affluent and environmentally conscious community with lots of rooftop solar, Warwick Cathro from the Australian Electric Vehicles Association said. New owner Mr. Mifsud, who is waiting excitedly for his Tesla to arrive, said the downside of buying the electric vehicle was the upfront cost. With current incentives in New South Wales and ACT and cheap loans for EVs, while also letting you have a car loan over 7 years instead of the usual 5 years, makes it manageable for us, he said. He said while price was his primary consideration, the environmental impact was a welcome plus. How nice to know that if I am idling at the lights, in a traffic jam, or at the school pickup, I'm not polluting the air our kids breathe, he said. Tesla released a report last week detailing how their cars are pretty much 100% recyclable and carbon neutral within a few years of driving them. That was ACT leads the nation on EV policy. That article by Lani Tyndale is on page 9 and is accompanied by a picture of an electric vehicle being recharged.
Thank you, Andrew. Reading today is Andrew Tremaine. I'm Camilla Shaw. It's time now for the editorial from today's Canberra Times, which is on page 14. PM's rush to open up could be deadly. The Prime Minister's shift from prioritising the preservation of life to the preservation of the economic recovery by resolving to open up as soon as adult vaccinations reach 70%, despite soaring case numbers, is a volte-face millions of people are struggling with. While the PM's position is supported by Gladys Berejiklian, it has not gone down well elsewhere, particularly in the Labour states of Queensland and Western Australia. The ACT government is rushing to reach a 90% vaccine target for maximum security. The Chief Minister has said local lockdowns won't necessarily stop when the Doherty targets are reached. The Liberal South Australian Premier has been far from vocal in his support of opening up early. This is because, with fears New South Wales case numbers could be running at 4,000 a day by late September, it is widely acknowledged once restrictions begin to ease, the whole country will see a spike in infections, hospitalisations and deaths far in excess of the Doherty predictions, which were based on 30 cases a day nationally. While the PM has been understandably coy about acknowledging the expected surge in deaths, saying case numbers will likely rise when we soon begin to open up, the Treasurer has been much more frank. Mr. Frydenberg, who says he will withhold federal assistance to any states which won't open their borders once the targets are met, said, "By living with COVID there'll be cases, by living with COVID there'll be people in hospital, and with living with COVID there'll be deaths." This is a lot to ask of jurisdictions such as Tasmania, 13 COVID-19 deaths, Western Australia, 9 COVID-19 deaths, Queensland, 7 COVID-19 deaths, South Australia, 4 COVID-19 deaths, the ACT, 3 COVID-19 deaths, and the Northern Territory, 0 COVID-19 deaths, which have done a sterling job of protecting their people. Case numbers were far lower when the National Cabinet signed off on the opening up strategy in late July. Much more is also now known about the frightening transmissibility of the Delta variant. Under the circumstances, the government's insistence on pressing ahead regardless is not pragmatic. It verges on being a reckless gamble with people's lives. It is not unreasonable, therefore, for the leaders of other states and territories to dig their heels in to protect their citizens. While it would be unnecessarily cynical to suggest the refusal to consider a pause before starting to lift restrictions is politically motivated, the PM would be well aware that to go to next year's election with much of the country in lockdown would be a disaster. He would also be mindful of the rising levels of lockdown fatigue and protests. This, as Anthony Albanese was at pains to point out in Question Time on Monday, raises the possibility political expediency could see the expert medical advice being cherry-picked. Although the Doherty Institute's professional Jodie McVernon has reportedly said her modelling didn't address the prospect of ending lockdowns with such a high caseload and that more work is needed, Mr. Morrison is holding the line. If politics are playing a part in shaping the government's position, he needs to understand that while going to an election under a lockdown would be terrible, going to an election when case numbers are rampant, ICUs are overflowing and deaths are soaring would be even worse. A strong leader would be honest enough to admit that when circumstances change, the response might need to change as well. Today's page 14 editorial, PM's rush to open up could be deadly. Thank you for joining us here on Radio 1 RPH in Canberra, where we tune on 11:25 a.m. Your reading today is Andrew Tremaine and I'm Camilla Shaw. We're getting towards the end of the readings from the Canberra Times. We've finished with sport, and here's Andrew.
Looking at the back page now, Camilla. Raiders sack troubled Scott. This article's by David Polkinghorne. The Canberra Raiders board has sacked troubled centre Curtis Scott, less than halfway through his 4-year deal. Scott's been charged with assault occasioning actual bodily harm for his alleged involvement in a fight at Civic nightclub Kokomo's on May 30. The 23-year-old's case was listed to appear in the ACT Magistrates Court next Monday, where he's planning to fight the charge. He appeared before the Raiders board along with his lawyer at a show cause hearing on August 17. It's believed there were also other separate, undisclosed incidents involving Scott the Raiders board used to make their final decision. Scott's manager, Sam Ayub, did not return the Canberra Times calls. The Raiders playing group was notified of the board's decision to sack Scott ahead of Monday's training session on the Gold Coast. Canberra signed Scott on a 4-year deal ahead of the 2020 NRL season. It's been a troubled time in the capital for the former Storm centre, who was subject to an unlawful arrest at the hands of New South Wales Police following Australia Day celebrations last year, before he'd even played a game for the Green Machine. Now his time with the Raiders has ended. He was fined $15,000 and suspended for 3 games by the NRL for the Kokomos incident, but the Raiders board has come down even harder with their patience wearing thin. They've shown in the past they're not afraid to act strongly when it comes to off-field behaviour, sacking stars Todd Carney and Josh Dugan. Scott has reportedly joined Alcoholics Anonymous and undergone psychiatric treatment in a bid to save his rugby league career. He's played just 23 NRL games and scored 3 tries since joining the Raiders, with a combination of suspension, injury and poor form hindering his impact in Canberra. Scott didn't go to Queensland with the rest of the Raiders squad and wouldn't have played for Canberra again this season anyway. The Raiders board said in a statement that Scott has brought the club into disrepute. The Canberra Raiders Board of Directors today decided to terminate the contract of Curtis Scott effective immediately, it said. The board carefully considered the statements made at the show cause hearing with Curtis Scott on August 17 and the material supplied afterward. The board decided that Curtis Scott's prior behaviour and recent assault charge has brought the club into disrepute, and they could not ignore this and the responsibilities that his NRL playing contract entails. The board said the club would continue to support Curtis Scott's ongoing rehabilitation, and it will be in contact with NRL welfare in this regard. That was Raiders Sack Troubled Scott. That article by David Polkinghorne is on the back page. Turning now to page 34. Supermum back after 17-year break. This article's by James Buckley. AIS duo Maddie Di Rosario and Eliza Alt-Connell are set for a Tokyo Marathon showdown, with the latter primed to make her Paralympics return after a 17-year hiatus. The pair exhilarated a parochial Australian crowd on the Gold Coast at the 2018 Commonwealth Games, when Di Rosario held off Alt-Connell by 13 seconds in a gold-silver double. Now the 39-year-old Alt-Connell is looking to turn the tables after touching down in Tokyo over the weekend, as she returns to the biggest stage for the first time since Athens 2004. Since then, she's had 2 daughters and a son with former partner and fellow Paralympian Kieran Alt-Connell, and become one of Australia's leading advocates in raising awareness around meningococcal. Back in 2016, we were watching the Paralympics in Rio. My daughter, Eva, turned to me and said, "Mum, you used to be really cool when you did wheelchair racing. Why don't you do wheelchair racing anymore?" Alt-Connell said. That's what started off this journey over the last 5 years. I guess every child hears stories from their parents before they were born, and they never quite believe it. Being able to watch the Paralympic Games for them and see what they did was pretty incredible. Alt-Connell, who had her legs amputated after contracting meningococcal aged 16, also contested the Melbourne Commonwealth Games in 2006 before retiring from competitive racing. After Eva inspired her to return, she collected that Gold Coast silver medal before turning her eyes to Tokyo, which she admits would be travelling into the unknown due to the global COVID pandemic, which has wreaked havoc on international competition over the last 18 months. We've all not been able to race any international marathons. What form is everyone going to be in? Alt-Connell asked. Australia is sending an amazingly strong women's athletics team, particularly. Madison Di Rosario, Angela Ballard, who's another Canberra local, Christy Dawes, Robin Lambert from WA. We're a small little group of racers, but I really believe that we will be able to represent Australia to the best of our abilities. If that means that we're up on the podium, well, that would be just the sweetest victory of all. Alta Connell remained in Canberra for the winter and spent her entire lead-up training at the AIS. That included being totally isolated from her family after the Territory went into lockdown earlier this month. But she was still able to train as an elite athlete and flew to Japan on Friday to end an astonishing 17-year wait between Paralympic Games appearances. The goal was initially just to get back in a race chair and maybe do a couple of fun runs, Alta Connell said. Having that experience at Gold Coast and having them watch when I came down the finish chute of the marathon and claiming the silver medal, I can't even begin to describe the feeling that gave me and the immense amount of pride. Just knowing the body's holding up, the mind's holding up. Let's try for Tokyo, and that's what we did. It's not only now, at this stage, it's not just for myself. I also like to think the next generation of children with disabilities, if they have dreams of competing for their country, I want to be able to show them that they can. And mothers, they can be more than just a mother. They can if they choose to, and if they desire to, not only, one, getting out there and being active, but they can get back into competitive sport again. Alta Connell will also contest the 100 metres and 400 metres T54 events in Tokyo. And in 11 years she hopes to make an appearance at the Brisbane Games, this time as a mother once more. Sport runs pretty deep in the family. My eldest daughter is quite the little athlete herself. She's now training out of the AIS a few times a week and is absolutely loving and thriving on the training. The thought of being able to represent Australia in Australia is something that will drive her to be the best that she can be. And there's already been the hint of, Mum, what if we did it together? It's beautiful, the fact she sees her mother as being invincible and being able to do anything, she said. That was Super Mum back after 17-year break. That article by James Buckley is on page 34 and is accompanied by a picture of Eliza Alta Connell returning to the Paralympics for the first time in 17 years.
Thank you, Andrew. Reading today is Andrew Tremaine. I'm Camilla Shaw. I see the opening ceremony for the Paralympic Games will be televised on Prime 7 this evening at 9:15 till 12:30. Good to give our support to our Australian teams. Thank you, Andrew, for preparing the Canberra Times for us both and for doing most of the reading. I'm very lucky with my readers. I had Janet earlier and I've Andrew now, and Andy Bell fills in, so I'm very, very lucky. If you would like to join us ever as a volunteer on Radio 1 RPH, why not contact us and come for an audition? We enjoy reading to you, and I hope you enjoy listening to us. And there's always lots to enjoy here. My name is Camilla Shaw, and before I go, some bits and pieces. First of all, from the private capital page of the Canberra Times with Amy Martin. Today in history. In 79, that's just 79, Mount Vesuvius erupts and buries the Italian cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Long time ago. And from my silly little book of one-liners, a gossip is one who talks to you about other people. A bore is one who talks to you about himself. A brilliant conversation is one who talks to you about yourself. Goodbye.